Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about ADHD and marijuana. So I hope all of you had a good Groundhog's Day. So starting Nate, and I hope you had a good Groundhog's Day. I hope you had isn't reflective of memory problems or stereotypical stoner reactions. What I'm going to say is that there's a lot of non-conclusive data on marijuana's effects on the brain, and specifically a dearth of information regarding marijuana and ADHD. So I'll start with my take-home message. Certainly marijuana use has been increasing across America and in other countries worldwide as well. Certainly more attention has been paid to it regarding people with ADHD and whether it may be helpful. And the data so far is actually, I would rate it as weakly supportive. So jumping into a more meatier discussion. So part of the challenge of talking about this is that historically we have a shortage of research on this. In the US, the government until fairly recently has said marijuana bad, 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 so bad you can't even study it. So unlike a variety of other substances, but many of the psychoactive substances, government has similarly said you can't study, but marijuana has certainly been in that class for years. So one is historically we just have less of a body, less long-term research or study. Two is that we're dealing with an herbal product. I mean, certainly there are purified extracts from there. So with an herbal product, most of the focus has been on two of the psychoactive cannabinoids, so THC or tetrahydrocannabinoid, and CBD, which is cannabidiol. However, the cannabis sativa produces more than 80 psychoactive compounds. We do think these are the two big ones, but they may not be the most important ones for every individual, or they may not even wind up being the most important in the long run. Certainly things like CBN, cannabinol has been receiving increased attention, and a host of others as well. So one is if you're, and so oversimplification, I'll start with, so sativa strain, so there have been two main, cannabis has been bred for two main psychoactive components. This is separate from breeding the plant for hemp extracts. But sativa varieties tend to be high in THC, and the indica varieties tend to be high in CBD. And this is, again, a gross oversimplification, but the THC seems more responsible or tied in with the euphoric, high hallucinogenic effects, and does seem to be more correlated with the uncommon but not vanishingly rare, so uncommon, but I've seen at least two cases, marijuana-induced psychosis effects, whereas the CBD, again, in the indica strains, is more associated with calming, anti-anxiety, pain relief, and may actually have some antipsychotic or protective properties there. But again, if you are smoking the whole plant, you're at the sort of, even if it's advertises one strain or another, that isn't telling you the precise chemical composition. And even if you're getting CBD products or THC or purified products off the shelf, given that this is not an area where government or other regulators have had a strong impact for years, you are sort of at the mercy at the quality of the buyer or seller. So Colorado, which is ahead of California and most other states in terms of trying to regulate what people are selling, last year, maybe it's a year and a half ago now, independent researchers collected lots of product off the shelf and showed that something like close to half of them, there was no strong correlation between what the label said in terms of how much CBD or how much THC and what the product actually contained. So that's not saying You can never trust the labels, but I'd say if you are using these substances and find a brand or maker that you like, stick with them, because the same product by someone else may not be the same product. So again, the fact that we're studying a mixture of compounds makes it more challenging for researchers, and research on pure CBD extracts versus THC may have no relevance to THC, may have no relevance to people who are using the product as a whole. And then a third area of challenge for this body of research is that there are a lot of studies looking for brain differences or looking at functional performance differences on psychological cognitive tasks, comparing marijuana users to non, comparing ADHD marijuana users to not. And if they find a difference among marijuana users in one functional brain area or one anatomic area or one psychological performance, what we have is a correlation, and the way most of the studies are done is they're observational or taken at a single point in time. That leaves us not knowing, did these people with different brains, did that predispose them to use marijuana at different rates, or to use it versus not using it? Or was it the marijuana use that caused and produced differences in brain growth and development and differences in neurologic, psychological functioning? So we have a huge chicken and the egg cause and effect relationship. So even studies that do find correlations, you're left not knowing, given the study designs, is it, again, marijuana use causing this difference, or was this difference actually producing changes in marijuana use? So jumping to some of the studies that we have, and specifically looking at ADHD, one of the things we know overall is that ADHD is strongly correlated with and seems to be a good predictor for substance use of a whole variety of substances: alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, speed, cocaine, pretty much anything that's looked at. Kids who have ADHD are much more likely than people in their same neighborhoods, same family, same areas, to develop substance abuse usage. And again, specifically, this has been looked at and studied for marijuana. One of the bigger studies found that ADHD itself, compared to the appropriate controls, kids grew up using marijuana at 7 or 8 times the background rate in the general population. So one other thing about some of these studies, the timing of when the study was done may matter a lot in terms of rates, because overall rates of marijuana use have been increasing in this country as a result of delegalization. So in a different era where marijuana use itself was less prevalent, it may have been easier to find extreme differences as the background rate rises. If 15% of the U.S. is using marijuana, then it's extremely unlikely that the ADHD rate will actually turn out to be 7 or 8 times as high, because that would mean everyone with ADHD uses marijuana, which is clearly not the case. So again, those relative prevalence rates are at some level going to be a historical artifact and conflated with background rates. So a multitude of studies have looked at what aspects or what characteristics or traits of ADHD may make marijuana use more likely. And both inattentive factors and hyperactive factors have been identified as increasing the risk for using. And this is oversimplifying, summarizing a little bit, but hyperactivity, impulsivity is associated with people who are making impulsive decisions, minimizing the long-term risks, delayed discounting effects, so that they're looking at, again, more of the benefit right now and not worrying about impairments cognitively or otherwise. There have been studies showing that kids with ADHD compared to their peers, if you just ask them, so this isn't even looking at their action in a specific instance, but just looking at their attitudes, are less worried, less aware of, less concerned with negative cognitive impairments psychological impairments from marijuana use. So again, both inattentive factors, so not paying attention to information and making more impulsive decisions, do seem to be correlated with higher rates of marijuana use. Another area that's been looked at in terms of just assessing self-perceptions of why people with marijuana are, people with ADHD, why they may be using marijuana. In several studies, many of the kids and young adults and adults with ADHD say they are using marijuana to self-medicate or to address their ADHD. So their own perception is that these medication, or the substance, is effective in treating or alleviating or helping with their ADHD. There are also studies looking at people who are on stimulants and other prescription medications for their ADHD, and clearly some people use marijuana to alleviate particularly anxiety revved up side effects from their that are side effects of their prescription medications. Marijuana, at least the self-perception is, may be effective in alleviating those side effects. So one of the sort of central conundrums or problems here is that these people are feeling that they're using marijuana to self-medicate or address their ADHD symptoms, but there does seem to be some overlap between potential detrimental effects of ADHD on the brain or on executive functioning and potential detrimental effects of marijuana. So there are a host of studies, many of them actually showing particularly people who are using infrequently or daily mild use have failed to find much psychological impairment in mild to infrequent marijuana use. More commonly, people who are using heavily and daily, there have been clearly some research there finds problems with poor organization, poor executive function, poor memory, specifically lower motivation, lower energy, slower information processing, slower reaction times, greater impulsivity. And again, those on the whole, again, so those effects of marijuana use, even if it's just particularly heavy marijuana use, look like they overlap with ADHD symptoms. So wouldn't you think this is a particularly bad substance to be using for your ADHD? So I'm going to get back to some of that in a minute, and I'm just going to share more of my clinical experience over the years. So certainly working in San Francisco for the last quarter century. As of this week, no longer in San Francisco. I've had scores of patients who were using marijuana, clearly at higher rates than the general U.S. population for most of the last quarter century, maybe closer to U.S. norms now. But people who are using marijuana specifically for their anxiety or for their depression, and in that realm, my experience has been of the people who stopped their daily marijuana use. I've had one exception. Again, this is not ADHD involved, this is depression, anxiety involved, people who felt they were self-medicating. Every other person who willingly stopped, and again, these were people who were convinced it was helping them, but when they stopped, and again, some of these people were getting now good beneficial help from prescription medications for their mood, but when they stopped, to a person, with one exception, they reported, oh, my thinking is clearer, I feel more motivated, I have more energy, I'm clearly doing better off this substance, off this marijuana, than on it, and yet for years I was telling myself it was helping. So again, that's in the depression or motivation, or anxiety realm. Does that mean, so one other caveat there, even although those people were convinced it was helping them, I do also have a subset of people who are using marijuana and continue to use marijuana for their anxiety, depression, and perceived it doing so. What I don't know is among those people who continued using it, if all of those people stopped, would they all also see these improvements in mood, energy, motivation, clarity of thought? Or maybe even though both of these groups who were originally thought they were self-medicating for their mood disorder, one group was willing to give it up, one group wasn't. Maybe that group that wasn't, maybe they represent people who genuinely were getting more sustained beneficial effects. I can't rule out that possibility, so I don't know. But again, what's striking is how skewed of the group who was willing to give it up for mood and anxiety, how much virtually all of them have done better. So jumping over to the ADHD realm, my clinical experience is I've had certainly a number of patients over the years who've been on prescription medications, have noticed some improvements, some with side effects that were significant, some with side effects that weren't that significant, but a subset of patients who have said, the marijuana helps me more than anything else I've tried for my ADHD, and particularly it helps me get out of my own thinking, my own sort of negative rumination, my own self-distraction. So the small bit of evidence, so there's been only one placebo-controlled study looking at marijuana use among those with ADHD, specifically looking at executive function and psychological cognitive performance. There have been a few studies looking at ADHD and marijuana use and looking at brain functioning. So maybe I'll start with the brain functioning studies first. They're small in number. What they were able to find is that in a few areas, and particularly cerebellar and hippocampal involvement, there were slightly different patterns in connectivity and in functional activation with different tasks, comparing people on ADHD who were using marijuana regularly versus non-regular users. Most of the studies, though, didn't find major differences. And in terms of performance among those tests, they didn't find marked performance differences. And the thought or explanation was different organizational or different activation, again, of different areas in the brain. And again, they were subtle, they were not major in these studies, that maybe people with ADHD on marijuana were compensating differently, or different parts of the brain could be engaged. So the one small study looking specifically at executive function tests statistically didn't actually find any difference between the marijuana group with ADHD and the marijuana-free group with ADHD. The differences that were not quite statistically significant actually did show a slightly better, again, these are not statistically significantly, so I'm not supposed to be even mentioning them, but there was a consistency in that it did look like the brains, that functionally these people who were taking marijuana, who did have ADHD, were functioning a little better on attention, a little better on hyperactivity, a little better on impulsivity. Again, this is one small study. These results were not statistically significant, but it was mildly encouraging or suggestive that there may be something real, and that even if marijuana may have detrimental effects, particularly at high doses, and effects that look like executive function impairment in some people, that doesn't necessarily mean in the group of people with ADHD that these are having negative effects on their brain. And I would argue to date, on average, again, in the mild to, or infrequent to mild to maybe even moderate range, the bulk of the evidence is suggesting that this may be a safe and possibly even effective approach for some people with ADHD, or helping with their ADHD symptoms. I mean, clearly there are other health risks, particularly if you're smoking or vaping, inhaling smoke is probably not a good idea for anyone's lungs. Um, Clearly, THC does seem to have an enhanced risk, even though it's a small one for psychosis, given that Adderall and maybe other stimulants also have that risk. I'd say, and given that that's a particularly nasty state to wind up in and may in some individuals be irreversible, I would be particularly cautious about THC containing marijuana products for people. And as I've said on almost every single topic I've talked about, this is certainly an area we need more research and more information. So that's about all I have to say. There are a couple people watching. I will try to stall for a minute to see if any questions come in as I'm speaking right now. And next week's topic is going to be about overlap and interactions between PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and ADHD. So I'm not seeing any questions. This will be posted on YouTube and Facebook. Have a healthy, happy, sane week, and I'll be back next Friday at 11, hopefully starting right on time then. That's all.